even more deliberate.
It's not simply a military issue, it's also a political issue. It's also an issue that involves all the Sunni states in the region and Sunni leadership recognizing that this cancer that has developed is one that they have to be just as invested in defeating as we are.
But he did say a long-term strategy will involve a military aspect. What will not? The situation in Ukraine. And the U.S. will not call Russia's latest moves an invasion, even though some in Ukraine are.
I think it is very important to recognize that a military solution to this problem is not going to be forthcoming.
So now the president is sending Secretary of State Kerry to the region. He said this Syria strategy that is forming is broader. It's going to involve that regional and international coalition, stabilizing Syria to some extent, and that sounds like it's going to take some time. He was also careful to say that it will include some consultation with Congress. Didn't want to go so far as to say he will ask Congress's permission for any potential military action in Syria. John?
Of course, he said that because he says he doesn't know what he would be asking for.
Exactly.
Shelley Kaczynski at the White House. Thanks so much.
All right, John, breaking overnight, Russia's foreign minister denying accusations that Russian troops crossed into Ukraine, but NATO says satellite images do show Russian troops crossed into Ukraine. In response, Russia's foreign minister says the images could be a farce, claiming they could be from computer games. This comes as Vladimir Putin gives a directive to pro-Russian rebels on the ground in Ukraine. He wants them to open a humanitarian corridor for Ukrainian troops to leave following the latest fighting. This despite refusing to acknowledge that those Russian troops crossed the border. Diana Magnate has more for us. She's on the ground in Ukraine. Diana.
Alison, I'm in a small village just a couple of kilometers away from the Russian border and very close to a town that was seized by the pro-Russian rebels yesterday. And I spoke to the commander of a battalion, one of the Ukrainian volunteer battalions, who says he was absolutely convinced that the men who took that town were Russian troops backed up by Russian tanks. And this adds to a body of evidence which seems to suggest that Russia is stepping up its involvement in the conflict in eastern Ukraine.
Pro-Russian forces gaining more ground as the fighting rages on. In rebel-held Donetsk, heavy shelling killed 15 civilians as Ukrainian troops tried to push back pro-Russian forces. The town of Novoazovsk seized after rebel forces, backed according to Ukraine by Russian tanks and artillery, battled Ukrainian troops for control. This morning, Russian President Vladimir Putin opened a so-called humanitarian corridor. The order: have pro-Russian separatists release Ukrainian troops trapped in the battle zone and provide medical assistance to the injured. On Thursday, as many as 1,000 Russian troops with heavy weapons crossed the southern border to fight alongside pro-Russian rebels, according to NATO. The fear in Ukraine that Russian troops might march as far as the coastal city of Mariupol. But already, this has opened a third front in the fighting, beyond the other separatist strongholds already in Donetsk and Luhansk. Ukraine accusing Russia of a full-scale invasion. The evidence is mounting as NATO provides satellite imagery that they say captures Russian forces on the move inside Ukrainian territory over the last several days. These images show a convoy of self-propelled Russian artillery units in the eastern area of Krasnodon.
They are only the tip of the iceberg in terms of the overall scope of Russian troop and weapons movements.
Now, we've driven up and down this border, at least in this region. It doesn't feel to us like a full-scale invasion, as the Ukrainians would put it, but it does appear as though there are more and more Russian troops getting involved in a wider area across this whole conflict, making it much more difficult for Petro Poroshenko and his army to have any kind of conclusive defeat over the pro-Russian rebels. John, back to you.
Right, Diana Magnate in Ukraine, talking about that wider area where Russian troops are now operating. I want to get more on this. We're here now with CNN military analyst, retired General James Spidermark. It's great to have you here, Spider. I want to take a look at this map. Diana Magnate just talked about this third front being opened up in this region. Let's take a look at this. The fighting has been going on in the cities of Donetsk and Luhansk. You can see them right there. That's where the fighting had been going on. Now you see these Russian movements into the southern part of Ukraine. Why?
What they're doing is they're isolating where the fighting has been. And it's important that that area stay as it's controlled right now. It's loose control, but that is kind of what we would say under an existing set of military conditions. This now further isolates that. That is established. This new area needs to be established so you can create this eastern complete corridor into Crimea.
And divert some troops maybe from that first area. Let's take a look at that corridor you're talking about into Crimea right now, because that's the other notion here. See the city of Mariupol right there? That is a key coastal city. Now, after these tanks and these Russian troops, maybe 1,000 of them, have moved in, it could create this contiguous line all the way to Crimea. We can see that right there. Of course, Crimea now effectively part of Russia. We don't recognize it, but the Russians say it's part of Russia. So now they have a full connection.
And John, that's what Russia has been trying to do for the longest time, is to try to completely take this eastern portion of Ukraine and make it contiguous so that Russia doesn't have to show its cards when it crosses the border, reinforces its existing locations that have been in Crimea for years. Primarily in Sevastopol, they've had to reinforce it, bring ammunition down there, etc. Now they want to own this completely. We've seen this developing over time. Putin now sees this as an opportunity to establish.
Let's talk more about what we've seen here. Let's walk over to this wall here, because NATO has released satellite imagery now of what they say is going on here. They have released these pictures. Hopefully we have 4 of them here. Well, let's take a look at this. We have this picture right here of what's going on in the region. I see what I think, Spider, looks like a column of tanks.
Well, it is. This is not a stealth invasion. What this is a blow-up of this column of tanks right here. And you can see all of these armored capability in Ukraine. So it's very, very obvious that Russia has moved these elements into Ukraine, and they're making it much more difficult for the Ukrainians to do anything against this type of firepower.
There have been some people who call this a stealth movement. This isn't particularly stealthy, Spider, is it?
Not at all. This is very obvious. This is irrefutable intelligence that allows us to start to piece together what the Russians are really trying to achieve here. This is war, not by proxy anymore. These are Russian forces in Ukraine.
Now, the other thing that we've seen, I think we have more images here, we've also seen pictures of self-propelled artillery. That, I believe, is down here. Let's blow that up right there. What is self-propelled heavy artillery, Spider?
Yeah, what that means is artillery that is mounted on tracks. They can move wherever they want. They don't have to be towed by another vehicle, which means it's very responsive. You can move these artillery pieces very quickly, get them into position, and you can fire and provide effects on targets very, very quickly. The Russians and previously the Soviets, this is really a Soviet formation, have had immense reliance on these kinds of capabilities. Artillery is really how they affect actions on the ground.
And the other thing that's really staggering about this, again, this is not stealthy. This does not look like anything else. These look like big, menacing weapons. You're making a statement when you roll these over the border into another country.
Yet Putin denies that he has a presence in Ukraine. Putin denies that he has forces in Ukraine. Putin clearly has the ability to alter what's taking place in Ukraine right now, and there is absolutely no reason why he would do that.
There are people in Russia, Russian officials claiming there are no Russian military personnel in Ukraine right now. Well, what they're saying is they may be on vacation. They may be Russian military service members.
Yeah, these aren't accidental tourists.
Well, artillery doesn't go on vacation. The personnel may go on vacation, but these things can't, correct?
Absolutely correct, John. The whole thing really aligns with Putin's ability. Let's remember where he came from and where his training has been. This is his narrative. This hasn't taken place. In fact, this chaos and the fact that he's being attacked personally plays directly into his story and his support.
Now, Spider, there's also a lot of talk about the terminology being used here, the word games. Is it an invasion, like the Ukrainians are saying? Is it an incursion, like some other officials are saying? Or is it a continuation of what we've seen in the past, which is what the president is saying? Do those words matter from a military point of view? Is this an invasion?
Words do matter. Words matter extremely. Very, very precise language is important in terms of how you apply military power and what you do about it. This is an invasion. It needs to be labeled that so that NATO, the United States, NATO, can take some appropriate actions to counter this.
General James Spider Marks, always great to have.